The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the thin curtains of the small apartment as Emma rocked her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, in her arms, trying to calm her fussing cries. The sound of distant traffic hummed through the walls, and her old Labrador, Max, lay near her feet, his ears twitching at every little noise. Emma's exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. Single motherhood had been overwhelming, but she had managed until now. Something felt off. She had felt it all afternoon, that strange sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled with unease. She shook the feeling away, pressing a gentle kiss to Lily's forehead, whispering reassurances, but Max suddenly lifted his head, his body stiffening, a low rumble building in his throat. Emma's breath caught in her chest. She turned toward the sliding glass door that led to the small balcony, her heart pounding against her ribs. The curtain shifted slightly, as if caught by a breeze, but the air was still. She reached for her phone, but her fingers trembled, dropping it onto the couch. Lily whimpered in her arms. Max stood now, his hackles raised, his gaze locked on the door. Emma took a slow step back, gripping Lily closer. She told herself she was overreacting, just a shadow, just the wind. But then there was a sound, the faintest creak of weight shifting on the old balcony boards. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. Max let out a sharp bark, lunging toward the door. The sudden movement made Lily wail, her tiny hands clutching at Emma's shirt. Panic clawed up her throat, her mind racing. There was no way out except the front door, but that meant turning her back on whatever was outside. She forced herself to breathe, trying to think. Max barked again, and this time she saw it, a figure just beyond the glass, motionless, watching her. The fading sunlight silhouetted the person, making it impossible to see their face. Emma's pulse thundered. She took a shaky step back, but the figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like they had all the time in the world. Max growled deep and low, his teeth bared, ready to protect them. Emma's hands tightened around Lily's small body, her baby's cries ringing through the room, drowning out every other sound except for the one that came next, the slow, deliberate sound of the balcony door handle turning. Emma's entire body locked with fear as the handle twisted ever so slightly, a slow, deliberate movement that set ice through her veins. She clutched Lily tighter, her daughter's cries rising in panic. Max lunged at the door, barking wildly, his body pressed against the glass, his snarls deep and raw. The handle stopped moving, but the figure didn't step away. Emma forced herself to move, every instinct screaming at her to run, but where she couldn't leave the apartment. The front door was too far, the windows too high. Her mind raced, searching for an option, any option. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to unlock it, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped it again. Max barked louder, the glass shaking slightly with each impact of his paws. Emma barely managed to dial 911, pressing the speaker button before pulling Lily even closer to her chest. Her voice came out shaky but firm. "There's someone on my balcony. They're trying to get in. I have a baby. Please send someone fast." She didn't care if she sounded hysterical. The dispatcher's calm voice responded, asking for her address and details. She rattled them off all while staring at the shadowed figure outside, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. Max was going wild, but it wasn't enough to scare them off. The dispatcher told her to stay inside, to lock the doors, to wait for officers. But Emma couldn't just wait. She glanced at the kitchen. The knife block sat on the counter just a few feet away. If she ran for it, she'd have to turn her back on the balcony. She hesitated, but then the whir sound, yet the sharp click of the lock disengaging. Her breath caught. She hadn't locked it. She had been outside earlier with Lily and Max, and she had forgotten to lock it. The door shifted slightly, barely an inch, but enough to make her heart slam against her ribs. No hesitation now. Emma spun, ran to the kitchen, gripping the largest knife she could find. As she turned back, Max had positioned himself between her and the door, his body low, ready to lunge. Lily was still wailing, her tiny hands gripping Emma's shirt. The door creaked open a fraction more, a single foot stepping onto the threshold. Emma didn't wait. She raised the knife, her voice shaking but loud. "Get out. I called the police. They're almost here." Max's snarls grew louder. The figure hesitated, finally reacting. The foot retreated slowly, and then, as if deciding it wasn't worth it, the figure stepped back into the fading light and disappeared. Emma's breath came in sharp gasps, her body trembling. She barely noticed the dispatcher still talking in her ear, barely registered the sirens in the distance. Help was coming, but the terror remained, because whoever they were, they had been watching, waiting, and they had known the door was unlocked. Emma's legs felt weak, her grip on the knife tightening, as she stood frozen in place staring at the empty balcony where the figure had just been. Max was still growling, his body tense, as if expecting the intruder to return. Lily's cries had quieted to soft hiccups, her tiny face pressed into Emma's chest. Emma forced herself to breathe, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She could hear the dispatcher still on the phone asking if the person was still there, but Emma couldn't answer. Not yet. Her ears were straining, listening for any sound, any sign that they hadn't really left. The sirens were getting closer, the wail of them cutting through the otherwise quiet evening, but the fear still gripped her, because whoever it was, they had been confident they hadn't run immediately. They had tested the door, they had watched her and Lily, and that meant they might come back. She forced herself to move, inching toward the balcony, reaching out slowly, with a shaking hand, and slamming the lock into place. She stepped back, exhaling shakily. Max finally stopped barking, but his ears were still pinned forward, his body still alert. Emma knew he sensed it too. The danger wasn't really over, even if the person was gone. The knock on the front door nearly made her jump out of her skin, her stomach clenched in fear. Before she realized it was the police, she hurried to open it, barely registering the two officers standing there before the words tumbled from her lips. They were out there on my balcony. They tried to get in. The officers stepped inside, scanning the apartment, their hands near their holsters, but not yet drawing their weapons. One of them, a tall woman, with a calm, steady voice, asked if she had seen their face. Emma shook her head. No, it was too dark. They never spoke, they just stood there. And then they tried the door. I forgot to lock it. Her voice broke on the last part, because the weight of that mistake was settling in hard. If Max hadn't been there, if she hadn't noticed in time. Lily let out a small whimper, her little fingers curling into Emma's shirt, as if sensing the tension. Emma pressed a kiss to her baby's head, trying to calm both of them. The officers moved to the balcony, one stepping outside, scanning the area with a flashlight. The other stayed with her, asking more questions. Had she noticed anyone watching her before? Had she heard any strange noises earlier? Emma tried to think, tried to remember anything out of place, but all she could focus on was that feeling she had all afternoon, the unease that had crept over her like a shadow, like something was just out of reach. The officer outside came back, in his face unreadable, no sign of him. But there are fresh footprints in the dirt outside the railing. Looks like they climbed up. Emma's stomach turned. They had climbed up, meaning they had gone out of their way to get to her balcony. This wasn't random. Whoever it was had targeted her specifically. But why? She was just a single mom in a tiny apartment with her baby. Why would someone do this? The officer's voice was firm but reassuring. We'll have patrols circle the area tonight, but I'd recommend keeping your doors and windows locked from now on. Do you have someone who can stay with you? Emma swallowed hard, shaking her head. No, it had always been just her and Lily. She had no one else. The officer nodded, exchanging a glance with his partner. We'll file a report, but if you notice anything strange again, call us immediately. Do you want us to check the building cameras? See if we can find anything? Emma's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't even thought about that. Yes, yes, please. The officer stayed a little longer, asking a few more questions before finally leaving, but Emma didn't feel any safer. She double-checked the locks, then checked them again. Max stayed close, his big warm body pressing against her legs, as if reminding her she wasn't alone, but the fear was still there, gnawing at her. As she held Lily tighter, rocking her gently, the sun had fully set now, casting the apartment in dim golden light, but the warmth of it did nothing to push away the chill in her bones. She didn't know who had been out there, or why, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over. Emma forced herself to move despite the numbness settling into her limbs. She double-checked the lock on the balcony door again, as if expecting it to suddenly spring open on its own. Then she moved to the windows, making sure every latch was secure. Max followed her, his ears still perked, his body tense. He wasn't convinced the danger was gone, and neither was she. Lily had finally dozed off, exhausted from the chaos, but Emma knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. Every sound made her jump: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the pipes, the wind outside rustling the branches. All of it sent her heart hammering in her chest. She needed answers. She needed to know who had been watching her. Had it been a random break-in, or was it something more? Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone, scrolling through the apartment complex's website, looking for information about security cameras. She found a number listed for the building manager. She hesitated. It was late, but she couldn't wait. She press call, her pulse pounding. As it rang after a few rings, a groggy voice answered. Hello, hi, I'm sorry for calling so late, but this is Emma Carter from 3B. There was an attempted break-in at my apartment tonight. The police were here. They mentioned checking the security cameras. I wanted to make sure that's possible. There was a pause, then the sound of wrestling like the man was sitting up in bed. Yeah, of course, I'll pull the footage. In the morning the cops should be able to access it too. But I can let you know if I see anything. Emma exhaled shakily. Okay, thank you, I'd appreciate that. She hung up, feeling only slightly better. The police would check the footage in the morning, but what about tonight? She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they weren't finished. She checked the locks again, her paranoia making her movements quick and jerky. Then she grabbed Max's leash, clipping it onto his collar. Before pacing the apartment, she wouldn't go outside, not after this, but having Max close made her feel a little safer. She wished she had more protection. She had never considered buying anything before, but now she wasn't so sure. She sat on the couch, Max curling up beside her, his body warm and solid. As Lily slept soundly against her chest, she tried to focus on the steady rhythm of her baby's breathing, tried to push out the fear. But then something made her freeze, a sound not from inside the apartment, but from outside, a soft scraping noise, like fingers dragging across the glass. Her blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly, heart pounding, and there, just beyond the balcony door, in the dim glow of the streetlights, was a shadow, a figure standing completely still, pressed close against the glass, watching. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her entire body locking up. As she stared at the shadowed figure just beyond the glass, her heart slammed so hard against her ribs she thought it might wake Lily. The scraping noise had stopped, but the figure hadn't moved. They were just standing there, watching, waiting. Her mind screamed at her to move, to grab her phone, to call the police again, but she was frozen. Max's body tense beside her, his growl rumbling low and dangerous. She could feel the muscles in his shoulders bunching, preparing to lunge, but the glass door stood between them. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to move as slowly as possible. She reached for her phone without breaking eye contact with the figure, but the moment her fingers brushed against the screen, the figure reacted, their hand lifted, pressing against the glass, just barely visible in the dim light. Long fingers splayed out, slow, deliberate. Emma's stomach turned. She could barely make out their face. The shadows obscured most of their features, but there was something off about the way they stood, the way they leaned in just enough that she knew this wasn't a mistake. They weren't lost, they weren't confused, they were here for her. She sucked in a sharp breath, snapping out of her frozen panic. She tapped the emergency number, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. Someone is on my balcony again. They're just standing there watching me. My baby is here. Please hurry. The dispatcher's voice was calm, asking her to stay on the line, asking for details. But Emma barely registered the words. Her eyes were still locked on the figure. And then suddenly they moved, not away, but closer, pressing their forehead against the glass, their breath fogging up the surface before slowly lifting a single finger and tracing a line down the glass. A slow, deliberate movement. A shiver crawled up Emma's spine. Max barked viciously, lunging forward, slamming his paws against the door. But the figure didn't flinch, didn't react. Emma knew she couldn't just sit there. She needed to get Lily somewhere safe. She needed to move. But the moment she started to shift, the figure finally reacted. They tilted their head just slightly before stepping back, disappearing into the darkness. Emma's breath came in short, sharp bursts. She didn't know if they were truly gone or just hiding, just waiting. Her fingers gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. The dispatcher's voice was still in her ear, telling her officers were minutes away. Emma forced herself to her feet, clutching Lily against her chest as she backed away from the balcony, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner of the apartment. Max stayed by her side, his ears pinned forward, his body still rigid, ready to fight. Any second felt like an eternity. She had never felt this kind of fear before, the kind that seeped into her bones, making every inch of her skin crawl. Then red and blue lights flashed outside, the sound of sirens slicing through the silence. Emma barely let herself breathe as the knock came at the door. It's the police, ma'am. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it, pulling it open to see two officers standing there, their faces grim. As they stepped inside, "Where did you see them?" one of them asked. Emma pointed, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They were right there on the balcony. They were watching me. The officers moved quickly, one heading straight for the balcony door, unlocking it, stepping out, flashlight sweeping across the space. Emma watched through the open doorway, her stomach twisting as he shone the beam downward. Then he cursed under his breath and turned back to his partner, footprints, fresh ones, leading from the balcony railing to the edge, and then vanishing like whoever it was had climbed down and disappeared into the night. The officer turned back to Emma, his expression serious but careful. "We need to check the security footage, and we'll have units patrol the area. But ma'am, whoever this is, they knew how to get up here, and they weren't in a hurry. That means this wasn't random." Emma's throat was dry. She already knew that deep down. She had felt it. This wasn't over. Emma tightened her grip on Lily, her pulse thundering in her ears as the officer's words settled in. This wasn't random. Someone had come here specifically for her. The thought sent a deep cold fear curling through her stomach. Her mind raced through every possibility. Was it someone from her past, someone she had crossed without realizing, or worse, someone who had been watching her for longer than she knew? She swallowed hard, her voice unsteady as she spoke. "What do I do?" The officer glanced at his partner before answering. "We'll stay on patrol tonight, but I'd recommend staying somewhere else for now. Maybe a friend or a family member, just until we figure out who this is." Emma hesitated, looking around the apartment. This was her home, her safe space, where she was raising her daughter, where she had built a life. But suddenly it didn't feel safe at all. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll figure something out." She didn't have family nearby, and the few friends she had were scattered across the city, but she wasn't going to spend another night here, not after this. Max stayed close to her, his body still tense, his ears flicking toward every small noise. The officer stepped back from the balcony, shaking his head. No sign of forced entry, but the footprints mean they climbed up here from the outside. It's not easy to do, but not impossible. He turned back to Emma. "Do you have any idea who might want to scare you like this, or hurt you?" Emma shook her head. "No, at least not anyone I can think of. I don't know why anyone would do this." But her words felt hollow, because deep down she knew this wasn't some random act. Someone had been watching her long enough to know where she lived, how to get to her balcony, and the thought made her skin crawl. The officer sighed. "We'll check the security footage first thing in the morning. For now, just focus on getting somewhere safe." Emma nodded again, her hands shaking as she grabbed a bag, stuffing it with essentials, diapers, bottles, a change of clothes for her and Lily. She clipped Max's leash onto his collar. She didn't care where she was going yet. All she knew was she wasn't staying here. She turned to the officers as she slung the bag over her shoulder. "Thank you for coming so fast." The officer nodded. "That's our job, ma'am. But be careful, okay?" She forced herself to take a breath before stepping out into the hallway, Max by her side, Lily stirring against her chest. As she made her way toward the elevator, her heart still racing, she didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing: whoever had been watching her tonight would be back. Emma kept her head on a swivel as she stepped out into the night, Max trotting at her side, his ears twitching at every little sound. She forced herself to stay calm, but her instincts screamed that she was still being watched. The police car was parked at the curb, its lights off, but she could see the silhouette of the officer inside watching the building. She felt a little safer, but not safe enough. She tightened her arms around Lily, who let out a small whimper, her tiny hand curling against Emma's chest. It was late, almost midnight, and she had nowhere to go. Her best friend Ava lived across town, but she didn't want to wake her. In a panic, she could get a hotel for the night, but the idea of sleeping alone in an unfamiliar room with Lily made her stomach turn. She needed to be somewhere familiar, somewhere she wouldn't feel like a sitting target. Then it hit her: her old apartment. Her lease had ended 2 weeks ago, and the new tenants weren't moving in until next month. She still had the spare key. She hadn't turned in yet. It wasn't much, but it was empty, and more importantly, no one would expect her to be there. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, finding the rideshare app, her fingers fumbling as she typed in the address. Within minutes, a car pulled up, a dark blue sedan. The driver rolled down the window, his face illuminated by the streetlights. Emma hesitated just for a second, then shook it off. She didn't have time to be paranoid. She climbed in, Max jumping in beside her, his body tense. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, glanced at her in the mirror. "Late night, huh?" She forced a smile, something like that he didn't press, and she was grateful. The ride was quiet, every streetlight casting long shadows. that made her skin prickle. She kept checking behind them, watching for headlights that seemed to follow too long, but nothing stood out. Finally, they pulled up to the old apartment building. She thanked the driver, hurrying out, Max at her side. She moved, quickly unlocking the door to the building and slipping inside. The familiar scent of the old hallways hit her. She hurried up the stairs, her heart pounding, every step echoing too loudly in her ears. When she reached the door of her old apartment, she fumbled with the key before pushing inside. The space was dark, empty, but it felt like a fortress compared to her last place. She locked the door behind her, sliding the deadbolt into place. Max sniffed around cautiously, then finally laid down near the door, his watchful eyes never leaving it. Emma let out a long, shaky breath, shifting Lily in her arms. She needed to calm down, needed to think rationally. She sat on the bare floor, resting her back against the wall, pressing her lips to Lily's soft hair. She felt like she should cry, but no tears came, just exhaustion, deep and suffocating. She didn't know who had been outside her window tonight, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let them find her again. But just as she started to let her body relax, Max let out a low growl, his head snapping toward the window. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her stomach twisting in knots, and then she saw it, a shadow moving just outside the glass. Emma's blood ran cold as she stared at the dark shape just beyond the window. Her grip on Lily tightened, her heart hammering in her chest. Max's growl deepened, his body tense and ready to spring. For a second, she thought maybe it was just her paranoia playing tricks on her. Maybe it was a tree shifting in the wind, or a reflection from the streetlights. But then it moved again, slow, deliberate, a figure pressing closer to the glass, as if trying to see inside. Panic surged through her veins, her mind racing with what to do. Her old apartment was on the second floor, just like the last one. No fire escape, no balcony. Whoever was out there had climbed up just like before. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. She had to act fast. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911, pressing it to her ear and whispering as soon as the operator answered, "Someone's outside my window, second floor apartment. I think they followed me here." Max let out another growl, louder this time, his ears pinned forward, his body low to the ground. The figure outside flinched at the sound, hesitated for a second, and then just like that it was gone. Emma's pulse pounded as she waited, barely breathing. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring. "We have officers on the way, ma'am. Do you have a way to secure yourself inside?" "Yes," she whispered. She wasn't sure if it was true, but she had to believe it. She scrambled to her feet, pressing Lily close as she moved quickly away from the window toward the small bathroom at the back of the apartment. She locked the door, her breath uneven. Max followed her inside, sitting right by the door, his ears still alert, his body a wall between her and whatever was out there. Minutes stretched on like hours, the silence unbearable, until finally the sound of distant sirens cut through the air. She held onto Lily, her body trembling as she listened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall outside, then a firm knock on the front door. "Ma'am, it's the police." Her knees nearly gave out in relief. She unlocked the bathroom door, inching toward the front, peeking through the peephole. Two officers stood outside. She quickly unbolted the door, letting them in. One stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. "Are you okay? Did you see their face?" Emma shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, just a shadow. But they were there." The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. "We'll check the perimeter, see if we can find any evidence. But ma'am, this is the second time in one night someone has tracked you down. You need to be somewhere safer. Do you have family nearby, anyone you can stay with?" Emma bit her lip, shaking her head. "No, but I'll figure something out." The officer's expression was serious. "Listen, whoever this is, they aren't just trying to scare you. They're following you. You need to be careful. Stay in well-lit places. Don't go anywhere alone." Emma swallowed hard, nodding. She knew he was right. This wasn't over, not yet. And until she figured out who was after her, she and Lily were still in danger. Emma's mind raced as the officers checked the windows and walked the perimeter of the building. Max stayed pressed against her leg, his ears still twitching, his body rigid with tension. Lily stirred against her chest, letting out a soft whimper, but Emma shushed her, gently rocking her even as her own hands trembled. She had no plan, nowhere to go, nowhere that felt safe enough. The officer closest to her, his name tag reading Daniel, studied her for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Listen, do you have somewhere to go tonight? A friend, a hotel?" Emma shook her head. "I was staying with a friend, but it's not safe there anymore." and I can't afford a hotel not for more than a night or two." Daniels glanced at his partner, who was still checking the window locks, then back at her. "We can have a patrol car circle the area for the rest of the night, but that won't help much if this guy's determined to find you." Emma exhaled shakily, gripping Lily just a little tighter. She already knew that she just didn't know what to do about it. A hotel wouldn't stop him. He'd already found her twice. What was stopping him from finding her again? Daniels hesitated, then sighed, like he was debating something before finally speaking. "Look, my sister runs a women's shelter not too far from here. It's secure. They have cameras, locked doors. I can get you in tonight. No paperwork, no questions asked, just a place to sleep, somewhere safe." Emma hesitated. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to seem like she was overreacting, but then she thought of the shadow at her window, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, and she knew she had no choice. "That sounds perfect, thank you." Daniels nodded. "Good, I'll drive you myself, safer that way." She felt a lump form in her throat, and just nodded, relief mixing with exhaustion. The other officer returned, shaking his head. "Nothing, no footprints, nothing on the cameras across the street. But if they climbed up here, they knew what they were doing." Emma shivered. Daniels gestured toward the door. "Let's get you out of here." The drive to the shelter was quiet. Emma sat in the back seat of the police car, Lily asleep against her chest, Max curled up beside her, but his head never lowered, his golden eyes watching the darkness, as if he knew something she didn't. Daniels didn't ask questions, didn't press her for details, and she was grateful. When they finally arrived at the shelter, it was a modest brick building, tucked away behind a gated entrance, the windows bright and welcoming but locked. The woman at the front desk greeted them with a warm, understanding smile, not asking for an explanation, just leading Emma inside to a private room with a cot, a crib, and a sturdy lock on the door. She set Lily down for the first time that night, brushing a hand over her soft cheek, the baby sighed, shifting in her sleep, peaceful, unaware of the fear that had gripped her mother all night. Max settled at the foot of the cot, his body still tense, but Emma finally exhaled for the first time in hours. She let herself believe that for tonight at least they were safe, but deep down she knew this wasn't over. Whoever was out there, they weren't done, and sooner or later she would have to face them. Emma barely slept that night. Every small creak of the building made her jolt awake, her heart pounding, her mind racing with the same terrifying thought, "He's going to find us again." Max never truly rested either, his ears twitching at every distant noise, his body positioned protectively between her and the door, as if he knew she was still in danger. By morning exhaustion weighed heavy on her limbs, but she forced herself up. Lily was still asleep, her tiny hands curled into fists against the blanket. Emma let out a slow breath, brushing a gentle hand over her daughter's soft hair. For a moment she allowed herself to feel grateful for the shelter, for the locked door, for the few hours of safety. But she knew it wouldn't last. She had to figure out what to do next. A soft knock on the door made Max lift his head, a low warning growl vibrating in his throat. Emma tensed, but then Daniel's voice came through the door. "Just me, you can open up." She exhaled, relieved, and unlocked the door. He stepped inside, looking just as tired as she felt, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, his gaze scanning the room, noting Max's alert posture and the exhaustion on Emma's face. "Sleep much?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "Not really." Daniels nodded, like he expected that. "Listen, I don't want to scare you, but we checked the security footage from last night." Emma's stomach dropped, her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "What did you find?" Daniels hesitated, then pulled out his phone, showing her a grainy image from the shelter's camera feed. Emma's blood ran cold. There on the screen was a figure standing just outside the gate, barely visible in the shadows, but unmistakably there, watching, waiting. Emma felt sick. "He found me," she whispered, her voice barely there. Daniels nodded. "We don't know how, but yeah, he did. He never tried to break and never got close to the door, but he stood there for almost an hour just watching." Max let out a low growl, as if he understood what was being said. Emma's hand shook slightly as she set the coffee down, her mind racing. This wasn't random. This wasn't just someone who happened to be watching her. Whoever this was, they knew her. They were following her, tracking her step by step. Daniels sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "You need more than just a locked door. You need to get out of town, lay low somewhere. He can't follow you." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "I don't have anywhere to go, nowhere. He won't find me. I've tried running already, and he always finds me." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then glanced down at Max, who was still tense, but quiet. Listen, I have a buddy, a retired K-9 trainer, owns a place way out in the country, middle of nowhere. He takes in people who need to disappear for a while. No questions asked. Emma stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're serious? Daniel's nodded. Dead serious. It's not much, just a cabin, some land. But it's safe. No one finds you unless he lets them. Max would have room to run. Lily would have peace. For the first time in weeks, Emma swallowed hard, looking down at Lily's peaceful face. This wasn't the life she wanted for her daughter, always running, always looking over her shoulder. But she didn't have a choice. She nodded finally. Okay, let's do it. Daniels exhaled in relief. I'll make the call. Pack what you need. We leave in an hour. Emma packed quickly, her hands shaking as she gathered the few belongings she had left. She tried to keep her movements steady, but the weight of everything pressing down on her was overwhelming. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, Lily's baby things, and a few keepsakes that she held dear. Her heart ached as she looked at the empty space around her. The walls of the small room that had, for a brief moment, felt like a safe haven. Max sat by the door, watching her carefully, his golden eyes alert as if sensing the tension in the air. He had been her protector from the start, and now he was the one that kept her grounded in the chaos. She knelt beside him, pressing her face into his thick fur for a moment, drawing comfort from his steady presence. We'll get through this, she told herself, even as doubt swirled in her mind. Lily stirred in her crib, letting out a soft coo before going back to sleep. Emma smiled at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and protectiveness. She would do whatever it took to keep Lily safe, to give her a life that was free from fear, even if it meant leaving everything behind. As she finished packing the last of their things, she heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. Daniels appeared, his face grim, holding a duffel bag with a few supplies. "Ready to go?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded, her heart heavy, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. This was their only chance. They left the shelter under the cover of early morning, the streets still dim with the last traces of twilight. The car ride was long, the landscape slowly shifting from city lights to the dark, empty stretches of country road. Emma held Lily in her arms, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, feeling the weight of uncertainty press on her chest with every mile they drove. Max lay across the back seat, his head turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the passing scenery, as if he were searching for any sign of danger. Emma knew he wouldn't rest until they were safe, and she was grateful for his vigilance. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the distant hills. It was quiet, too quiet, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that someone was always just a step behind. But as they pulled into the long driveway, she saw the cabin in the distance, nestled among the trees. It looked small but sturdy, isolated, and far away from everything. "Welcome to your new home," Daniel said, his voice soft. "You'll be safe here." Emma looked out the window, her eyes scanning the area. It wasn't much, but it was theirs now. It was the only place she could go to keep her daughter safe, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe it. She could breathe a little easier. They unloaded the car, and Emma carried Lily inside, settling her into a small, cozy room with a crib and a rocking chair. The cabin was rustic but warm, and as Emma stepped back outside onto the porch, she could feel the weight of her decision settling over her. Max padded out after her, sitting at her side, as they looked out over the surrounding woods. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and earth filling her lungs. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace, of calm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Daniel stood beside her, his gaze shifting from the cabin to the woods beyond. "You'll be safe here," he repeated. "But you need to stay vigilant. He'll find you if he's determined enough." "I know," Emma whispered, her heart heavy with the truth. "But I'm ready to fight for her." "For Lily," Daniels nodded. "I'll check in on you, but I have to go." Take care of yourselves. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call." He got in his car, giving Emma one last look before driving off down the long road that led to the nearest town. Emma watched until his taillights disappeared, and then she turned back to the cabin. Inside, she found a quiet moment with Lily asleep in her crib. Max lay down beside the door, his watchful eyes never leaving her. She ran a hand through her hair, taking in the stillness of the place, the promise of safety. But even as she allowed herself a brief moment of relief, a part of her knew the truth. The danger wasn't over. They were still being hunted, still being watched. The world outside these walls was full of threats, but for now, Emma and Lily were together. And as long as they had each other, Emma was ready to face whatever came next. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she would be ready, no matter what. With a deep breath, she pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the world for the night. But in her heart, she knew she was prepared. Whatever was coming, she would protect her daughter, no matter the cost. And so, for now, they were safe. But Emma couldn't afford to forget that the battle was far from over.